Hello and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 58. The Light of the Faith. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we discussed the end of the Second Crusade, at least its end in Anatolia. After annihilating the German crusaders at the Second Battle of Dorylaeum, Sultan Mesud had assembled the armies of the Sultanate and crushed the French crusaders at the Battle of Mount Cadmus. And though the crippled Second Crusade would drag itself to the Levant from Anatolia, the fate of the Second Crusade, and indeed the fate of Outremer itself, was now effectively sealed. Sultan Mesud, the fourth Roman Sultan, thus achieved his place in history as one of the greatest Muslim heroes of the Crusades. And today, we will discuss Mesud's follow-up to these great victories and his final consolidation of power in Anatolia, the culmination of his efforts to rebuild the Sultanate. And we will set the scene for the last chapter of Mesud's life, and welcome onto the stage another Turkish leader, one who will be with us for several episodes to come, the greatest Muslim conqueror to live between the days of Tughral and the days of Saladin, Nüreddin Zengi, the Light of the Faith. Now to begin, remember that the victory of the Sultanate of Rum over the Crusaders had not been accomplished alone. Mesud had a powerful ally in Constantinople, the Roman Emperor Manuel Komnenos. The two Anatolian peoples, the Turks and the Greeks, had united against the Western infidels or heretics, depending on which of them you talk to. This alliance had then basically annihilated the German and French armies. But now, with the Latins gone, you would think that this alliance would fall apart. I mean, despite a lot of cooperation constantly going on between Turks and Greeks, especially in the frontier world, the two political capitals, Konya and Constantinople, were often in conflict. Roman and Turkish political leadership would of course ally when advantageous and when they faced common enemies, but now with the Crusaders gone, you sort of think that the alliance would shortly fall apart. But surprisingly, that did not happen this time, and I think that in large part this was because there still were common enemies of both the empire and the Sultanate. The primary feeling in the West, as word began streaming back about the supposed treachery of the emperor, was indignant outrage. Now, the emperor was trying to soothe the Latins, and he had been extremely hospitable to Conrad and other crusaders who dejectedly marched home after their armies had been destroyed. But the fact remained that the Latins were a potentially existential enemy, and the Turks could well prove to be a crucial ally if the Latins were to return to seek vengeance. More importantly, there were still the Crusaders in Outremer. Already, the Romans and the Crusaders had gone to war over Cilicia, the Roman possession in southern Anatolia abutting Outremer and basically ruled by Armenians. Now, we're really going to get into this next time, but Cilicia will continue to be a major flashpoint between Constantinople and the Crusaders, as their already tense relationship continues to break down. Thus, it was not really in the west that the alliance between Constantinople and Konya played out, but rather in the east. Now, to cover the situation in the Middle East and eastern Anatolia, including Mesud's upcoming campaign, we need to step back a bit. Though Edessa had been lost to the Crusaders in 1144, that wasn't quite yet the end of the county of Edessa or of its count Jocelyn II. As the appeal to aid Outremer reverberated around Europe, Jocelyn returned to the west bank of the Euphrates after the fall of Edessa to Imad al-Din Zengi, and managed to hold a thin strip running along the west bank of the river. There he hunkered down, hoping that either his allies in Antioch or Jerusalem would come to his aid, or that yet more crusaders would arrive from the west. In the meantime, Imad ad-Din Zengi began marching south, intending to take Damascus, now held by a minor Turkish beylik called the Burids. Damascus seemed destined to fall to the mighty Zengid armies up until September 14th, 1146. That is, the same time Conrad and Louis began assembling their doomed armies. In a kind of hilarious incident, Imad al-Din Zengi, feeling quite pleased with himself and how well his great jihad was going, basically got completely blackout drunk while besieging a small castle on the way to Damascus. With him was a Frankish slave named Yaran Kash, almost certainly a Turkification of some European name that we just don't know. Yaran Kash was apparently well esteemed by Zengi and was one of his frequent drinking buddies. Ibn al-Qalanisi tells us that Yaran Kash was a man for whom he had special affection and in whose company he delighted. Now, if you will recall, being a slave was not necessarily a mark of low social status, and many powerful emirs and warriors were themselves enslaved. Indeed, the Zengid dynasty itself descended from Turkish Mameluke slave soldiers. And quite interestingly, it appears that Yaran Kash was basically a Latin slave soldier, a European Mameluke. And as often happened in the Seljuk world, the Emir Imad al-Din Zengi routinely got rowdy and drunk with his attendants and companions and Mamelukes. So while drinking with the Sultan on September 14th, it appears that Yaran Kash grabbed Zengi's drinking goblet and took a huge quaff from it. This caused the completely wasted Zengi to flip out and drunkenly threaten Yaran Kash. And Zengi was not a man whose threats were to be taken lightly. He was an extremely stern and often vicious ruler who would go so far as to order the crucifixion of his foes. Understandably terrified, quite drunk and angry, and perhaps feeling some resentment at his status as a Latin Christian enslaved to a Turkish Muslim, Yaran Kash soon pulled a knife and fell on the emir, stabbing Imad al-Din Zengi to death. He then tried to make an escape and made it as far as Damascus, no doubt hoping that the late emir's enemies would shelter him. Instead, terrified of the consequences of angering the heirs of the great Imad al-Din Zengi, the Burid Bey of Damascus immediately handed Yaran Kash over to one of Zengi's successors, the next great emir of the Zengid Emirate, and the man who really is the precursor to Saladin, Imad al-Din Zengi's second son, Nüreddin. Nüreddin came to power basically immediately after the death of his father. But as befits the messy Turkish rules of succession, he would not rule alone, at least for now, because his elder brother, Saifuddin Ghazi, assumed power back in Mosul, what was basically the capital of the emirate. Saifuddin is Arabic for the sword of the faith, while Nüreddin is of course Arabic for the light of the faith, fitting names for princes of a dynasty that legitimized its rule through assuming the mantle of jihad and came to power with the explicit goal of driving the Crusaders out of the Levant for good. But with Imad ad-Din Zengi now dead, Jocelyn II naturally thought, hey, now's my chance. So as Nüreddin began what would be his illustrious reign by consolidating his power in Syria, Jocelyn rushed back to Edessa and managed to put the city to siege in October 1146. As soon as he heard the news that Jocelyn was besieging Edessa, Nüreddin began assembling his Turkmen armies. Ibn al-Qalanisi tells us that the army numbered 10,000 strong, which may be a bit of an exaggeration, of course. He further tells us that Nüreddin's army advanced extremely quickly, trying to defeat Jocelyn before the Crusader could take the city, but to no avail. Ibn al-Qalanisi writes, "They marched with all speed, night and day, and in the early hours of the morning, so that the horses dropped by the roadsides from the fatigue of the march, and arrived at the town." Ibn al-Qalanisi of course claims that after taking the city, Jocelyn put all of the Muslims in the city to death, but I think we need to take that with a grain of salt. I'm sure that many people died and that it was brutal, but just as Christian authors often exaggerated Muslim brutality, so too did Muslim authors exaggerate Christian brutality. Now back in Edessa, and with Nüreddin rapidly approaching, Jocelyn desperately reached out to the other Crusader lords of Outremer. Surely they would come to his aid, right? But no. The reality was that the other Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, and the County of Antioch, were just stretched too thin at this point, and were of course waiting for the arrival of more Crusaders from the west. And thus, Jocelyn's attempt to retake Edessa was destined to fail, this time permanently. In the first victory of what will be a great and storied career, Nüreddin surrounded Edessa and swiftly retook the city. Jocelyn simply did not have the troops to hold it. As his armies basically melted away under the Zengid attack, Jocelyn fled. Edessa, modern-day Urfa in southern Turkey, first founded by Seleucus I, one of Alexander the Great's generals, would not again fall under Christian rule until the brief British and French occupation of Syria after the Ottoman collapse in the First World War, until again being returned to Muslim hands by the victories of Ataturk and the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. Fleeing from Edessa, Jocelyn and his family made for the safety of Tel Bashir. Tel Bashir, today Gündoğan in southern Turkey near the border with Syria, was an absolutely ancient fortress. Likely, it had first been established in the Bronze Age by the Hurrians, before being conquered by the Hittite Empire. It was a critical fortress to control the western bank of the Euphrates, with the river itself lying only 20 kilometers from the fortress. And it now became the de facto capital of the shattered remnants of the county of Edessa. Thus, by the time the Second Crusaders finally straggled broken into Jerusalem in spring 1148, there was simply no way for them to retake Edessa. They were too weak, having been almost destroyed by the Sultan of Rum, and Nüreddin was too strong. Still, King Louis decided to make an attempt on Damascus after swinging through Jerusalem and Antioch. This, of course, caused the buried emir of Damascus to freak out and beg Nüreddin for aid that was actually not swift in coming. See, Nüreddin wanted to make sure that he, and not some buried bey, saved the city. If the Burids lost it, well, that would just make his reconquest of it all the better. And so Nüreddin dragged his feet, likely hoping that the Crusaders would take the city and in doing so mortally wound themselves. However, it turns out that the Crusaders were just in no shape to take Damascus. Having endured grievous defeats at the hands of Mesud and the Turks of Anatolia, they were just not in a position to fight here. The great crusading armies, too numerous to count as they had crossed the Bosphorus, had been virtually annihilated by the Turks. Now, the remnants, led by King Louis, were just not capable of taking a city like Damascus. Nevertheless, the Crusaders put the city to siege on July 24th, 1148. That is, about 6 months after their near total destruction in Anatolia. The siege would end up lasting for only 4 days. Even before the Zengid reinforcements finally arrived, the Burid forces had largely beaten back the Crusaders. Then Nüreddin arrived, and he began negotiating with the Burids to hand over the city as his armies began engaging the Crusaders. On July 28th, local Crusaders told King Louis and the new arrivals that the game was up. There was no way that the city could be taken, and in any event, it would be better if it stayed in Burid hands rather than fall to the rising might of the light of the faith. And so, after just 4 days in front of the walls of Damascus, the Second Crusade finally ended, totally ignominiously. King Louis was soon on a boat back to France, and the Crusader possessions in Outremer began looking more and more doomed. So after defeating the Crusaders in Anatolia, this was the Middle East that Sultan Mesud saw as he gazed east and south from Konya in late 1148. The Second Crusade was finished, in no small part thanks to his own efforts. Edessa was in Zengid hands, and the county of Edessa was reduced to a pocket of land hugging the west bank of the river Euphrates. But the Latins remained in Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem, basically the whole Mediterranean coast. And in Syria, there was this new rising power, Nüreddin Zengi, the light of the faith. And like other confident and victorious sultans of Rum, Mesud began looking to his east, especially as his alliance with Emperor Manuel Komnenos ensured that he did not face a Byzantine invasion from the west. But unlike his father Kılıç Arslan or his grandfather Suleiman, Mesud was not seeking to become the great Seljuk Sultan of the west. Indeed, that job had kind of disappeared by this point. Now far to the east, in Khorasan and Balkh, the great Seljuk Sultan Sanjar continued his long reign, of course. Indeed, the eastern half of the great Seljuk Empire under his rule was now living through a great golden age. But in the west, the Sultanate had basically evaporated following the invasion of the Crusaders and the chaos of the Seljuk Wars of Succession. Indeed, Muhammad Tapar had been the last great sultan of the West to actually rule in a meaningful sense. Through ceaseless campaigning and canny politicking, Muhammad Tapar, had rebuilt a great deal of the state's authority, at least in Iraq, Syria, and Iran. But that unification died with him in 1118. As we discussed earlier, after his death, the state fell into the hands of the emirs basically permanently. In the classic story, civil wars among the claimants to the throne compounded with the rise of the powerful emirs and beys, the Artukids, the Zengids, the Burids, and in Anatolia, the Saltukids, the Danishmends, and the Sultans of Rum, of course. This led to a string of weak, nominally great sultans of the West, who ended up mostly being propped up by the real great Seljuk Sultan in Khorasan, Sanjar, and the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. Currently, the nominally great Sultan of the West was coincidentally enough named Mesud, but he was little more than a puppet, nominally ruling large parts of Iraq and western Iran. So there was, in a practical sense, no great throne for Mesud to even fight for in 1148. But the Anatolian southern and eastern frontiers of the Sultanate of Rum were still of critical importance to Mesud. And this was especially true when you remember how recent his rise to actual power really was. Yeah, he had been the Sultan of Rum since 1116, so for over 30 years at this point. But he had only really become the overlord of Turkish Anatolia after the death of the Danishmend king of the north, Muhammad, in 1142. And his rapid conquests of Sivas, Kayseri, and basically all of central and northern Anatolia had been followed immediately by a war with the emperor and then the Crusader invasion. So it was really only now that Mesud had the opportunity to breathe and to really focus on his eastern frontiers. In particular, there were two targets that Mesud had his eyes on, and they won't be a surprise at all. Both were places where his father had campaigned, cities that guarded the passes to and from the plateau that winded up through the steep mountains. One was, of course, Malatya. I mean, we've seen Roman sultans try to take Malatya for decades at this point, including Mesud himself previously. Now, Malatya was in the hands of one of the late King Muhammad's children, Ain al-Dawla. Mesud was of course extremely interested in recapturing it, but he appears to have hesitated, because with the county of Edessa in full-on collapse, Mesud's attention had turned to the other great city guarding the passes into Anatolia, and one that was now actually more valuable, Marash. See, as I mentioned in earlier episodes, the creation of the Crusader states of Outremer had the unintended side effect of basically cutting off the frontier world of Anatolia from the center of the Muslim world in Iraq, Syria, and even to some extent in Iran. These Christian states now sat on the best routes to and from the plateau, in particular the Great Cilician Gates, which were sort of the traditional route to and from the plateau to the Middle East. The eastern passes were far harder and less navigable, and in any event, entered the plateau far from the heartland of the Sultanate. But now, the county of Edessa was on its deathbed, and this meant that the passes around the city of Marash would descend not into a Crusader state, but into the Muslim world itself, assuming that the county could be finished off. This made them immensely valuable to the Sultanate. Anatolia's connection with the heartland of the Muslim world could finally be secured again after what amounted to decades of separation. And as we will soon see, this will lead to a new alliance between the two greatest Turkish opponents of the Crusaders, the two men who had, between them and with the Roman Emperor, utterly crushed the Second Crusade, the Sultan of Rum Mesud I, and the Zengid Emir Nüreddin. These campaigns effectively began in late 1148, that is, basically immediately after the destruction of the Second Crusade. The catastrophic failure of the Second Crusade led the Prince of Antioch, Raymond of Poitiers, to lash out. Prince Raymond was already extremely incensed that the crusade had failed and that King Louis had dejectedly headed back to France, and so he now launched a vengeful raid to the north, into the lands of Turks who were by now vassals of the Sultan of Rum, before returning back to Antioch. This led Mesud to retaliate, and in summer 1149, an army likely led by the future Sultan of Rum, Kılıç Arslan II, marched out against Maraş itself, determined to take this crucial city. Bar-Hebreus relates, "And in this year, the son of Mesud, the Sultan of Iconium, encamped against Maraş, and he took it from the Franks, and having allowed the Frankish horsemen and the bishop and the elders to depart to Antioch, because forsooth of the oaths which he had sworn them, he dispatched the Turks to attack them, whilst they were out on the road, and they killed them." Bar-Hebreus also laments that the Turks looted the great Suryani church in Maraş, and that most of its valuables were seized. More importantly, from the Turkish perspective, Maraş and its passes were now in the Sultan's hands. Meanwhile, to the south, Nüreddin was drawing nearer to the borders of the Sultanate of Rum. As part of consolidating his control over Syria, Nüreddin targeted one of the outlying fortresses of the Principality of Antioch, called Inab, which lies just outside of Aleppo. Nüreddin marched his army to Inab in early 1149 and put it to siege. This caused Raymond of Poitiers, the Prince of Antioch, to basically freak out. So he made an alliance with the Ismaili Order of Assassins, the Nizaris, and marched out to relieve Inab. But Raymond made a huge mistake. He camped out in open country when approaching the fortress. This allowed Nüreddin to assemble his Turkmen steppe riders, swoop in, and assault the combined Crusader-Nizari force. The fighting was fierce, and the Crusaders attempted a great charge to defeat the Turkish riders. But as often happened, the Turks were able to disperse and ensnare the attackers in a feigned retreat. Ibn al-Qalanisi tells us, "When they met eye to eye, the infidels made their famous charge upon the Muslims, but the Muslims split up into detachments which attacked them from various directions and swarmed over them. The two forces engaged in a hand-to-hand struggle, enveloped in thick clouds of dust, and the swords of Islam had the final word against them." Prince Raymond was captured and beheaded, with his severed head sent off to Baghdad as a gift to the Caliph. Incidentally, the man who did the beheading happened to be an obscure Kurdish commander who served as a lieutenant to Nüreddin. The lieutenant's name was Sherko, meaning in Kurdish, the Lion of the Mountain. And Sherko happened to have a young nephew, only 10 years old at this point, a child who bore the name Saladin. After defeating the forces of Antioch and killing Raymond of Poitiers, Nüreddin continued to march forward. According to Ibn al-Qalanisi, he even advanced as far as Antioch itself, forcing the local crusaders to flee into the city and bar it against him. But surveying the massive walls of Antioch, Nüreddin realized that he could not take the city. At least, not yet. And so while he of course ravaged the land and sent his men out to engage the Crusaders, he instead marched to the Mediterranean Sea. There, Nüreddin symbolically bathed in the waters of the Mediterranean. This was in fact a Persian political tradition that went back to the Sassanids before the coming of Islam. The Persian Shah symbolically bathing in the Mediterranean after defeating the Romans and reaching the sea. Now, the ancient ritual was repeated by Nüreddin. This was both a show of his power in reaching the sea over which the Crusaders had come, and a bold proclamation of his intention to drive them back into it. He then pulled his army back, and by aiding the city of Damascus in beating back a Crusader assault, and kind of also just through sheer reputation and vibes, he forced the Burids in Damascus to submit. Ibn al-Qalanisi, who was actually in Damascus at this time, says that the city's Burid rulers submitted, and the khutbah was read in the name of Nüreddin. Most of Syria was now, effectively, under the rule of the light of the faith. This is then what put Mesud and Nüreddin in direct and sustained contact. Because with Marash in Mesud's hands, and Inab and most of Syria in Nüreddin's hands, the two greatest leaders of the Muslim world, at least in the Middle East and Anatolia, were now able to easily communicate, and even to conduct joint military operations. And soon enough, the armies of the Sultanate of Rum and the armies of the Zengid Emirate would work together to rip apart the county of Edessa. Though as we will see, Mesud and Nüreddin remained wary of each other, and while happy to ally against the infidel enemy, each tried to consolidate his own position and not allow the other to box him out. 1148 and 1149 thus saw the two great Turkish potentates moving swiftly to carve up the possessions of the collapsing county of Edessa. The Crusader chronicler, William of Tyre, tells us that upon hearing of Nüreddin's victory in Antioch and the killing of Raymond, the Sultan also went down into Syria with an immense host, and that Mesud took many fortresses and castles of the region. Finally, in 1149, Mesud took his army to Tel Bashir itself, the ancient fortress that now served as the embattled capital of the collapsing county of Edessa. The Sultan of Rum harassed the environs and put the fortress under a sort of loose siege while Jocelyn and his family remained inside. However, this siege would prove to be short-lived. William of Tyre tells us that reinforcements soon arrived from the Kingdom of Jerusalem, strengthening the garrison in Tel Bashir. And in an omen of things to come, it appears that Nüreddin himself intervened to negotiate a truce that involved a tribute payment from Jocelyn to Mesud. Apparently, the light of the faith was determined that Tel Bashir would fall to him and to him alone. Meanwhile, as Mesud marched around northern Syria, Ibn al-Athir tells us that in 1149 Nüreddin campaigned further to the south. After his campaign to Antioch and his ritual bath in the Mediterranean, the light of the faith marched on to take Apamea on the river Orontes, upstream from Antioch itself. Now, as this city was crucial to controlling the upper reaches of the Orontes, and thus the approach to Antioch, this caused the Crusaders to freak out, and they scraped together the dwindling Crusader armies in Syria to stop the light of the faith. but by the time they reached the city, it had already fallen to Nüreddin, and so they thus tried to come to a temporary truce with him. Nüreddin thus returned triumphant to Aleppo. Reportedly, the poet Ibn Munir al-Tarabulisi wrote the following poem to honor the light of the faith as he entered Aleppo in triumph. The most exalted of realms is one whose beacon you have raised high, and made sharpened sword blades its nails. The most worthy to rule the land and its people is a merciful one, whose justice has embraced its regions. So as Mesud and Nüreddin began ripping his county apart from both north and south, in Tel Bashir, Jocelyn II was now desperate for aid. The county of Edessa was in full-out collapse, clinging for life to the west bank of the river Euphrates from the fortress of Tel Bashir. With the Second Crusade finished before the walls of Damascus, if there was to be any hope at all of the county surviving, he needed aid from Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem, and he needed it now. And so, fatefully, Jocelyn saddled up and rode out of Tel Bashir, making for Antioch in the west. But with the armies of Mesud and Nüreddin advancing everywhere, and with the Crusaders in full retreat, this was going to be a very dangerous ride. And perhaps unsurprisingly, it ended extremely badly for Jocelyn II. As Jocelyn marched out of Tel Bashir, riding towards Antioch in the west, his small party was quickly scouted out by a party of Turkmen loyal to Nüreddin. They began to shadow the count, looking for an opportunity to strike. This opportunity came about soon enough in a sort of hilarious way. Remember that Antioch was several days' ride from Tel Bashir, and, well, as anyone who has taken a long road trip knows, humans can't hold it for several days while traveling. Soon enough, the Count needed to make a quick stop, if you catch my drift. Not really wanting to pop a squat in front of everyone, he rode away a bit from the rest of the party. As William of Tyre delicately puts it, attended only by a young man who was leading his horse, he had left his escort and turned aside to relieve the needs of nature, when unknown both to those ahead and those following, he was attacked by brigands who rushed forth from ambush. Thus, literally caught with his pants around his ankles, Jocelyn II was bundled up and packed off to Nüreddin. Delighted to have the Count of Edessa in his hands, Nüreddin decided to make a bit of a spectacle about it. Jocelyn was dragged out in front of the people of Aleppo and publicly humiliated by the crowd before being blinded and thrown into the dungeons of the city. He would languish in chains for a further 8 miserable years. The county of Edessa was now without a count, and indeed without any hope to survive. Ibn al-Athir writes of the capture and imprisonment of Jocelyn. His capture was one of the greatest success because he was an intransigent devil, fierce against the Muslims and cruel. His capture was a blow to all Christendom. With Jocelyn thus out of the picture, Mesud and Nüreddin began directly coordinating a combined military campaign to finish off the doomed county. Now, just a small pocket of land to the west of the Euphrates. Mesud advanced south to what is now the border between Turkey and Syria around the city of Antep, taking several small fortresses in the region. Meanwhile, Nüreddin marched north out of Aleppo taking what remained of the county of Edessa's fortresses in the south. The two armies then converged on Tel Bashir itself, the fortress that now constituted the capital of whatever could still be called the county of Edessa. Mesud and Nüreddin thus put Tel Bashir to siege together, likely meeting for the first time in front of the walls of the fortress. After a sit-down, the two agreed that Tel Bashar would be given to Nüreddin on its fall, but as a dowry present from the Sultan. The two greatest Turkish potentates of the West agreed that Nüreddin would wed Mesud's daughter, making the Sultan of Rum the father-in-law of the Light of the Faith. Now, we don't have the details of this meeting or the reasoning behind this agreement. However, it's not too difficult to ascertain that Mesud's army must have been vastly outnumbered by the forces of Nüreddin. In all likelihood, it became more or less immediately apparent to Mesud that there was simply no way that he could hope to project power in northern Syria in a meaningful sense. The rising might of Nüreddin simply meant that the ability of the Sultan in Konya to dominate Syria was extremely limited. The best that Mesud could hope to do was to hold the mountain passes onto the plateau itself, Marash, and God willing, one day Malatya. And so, seeing that there was no way for him to progress further, Mesud basically turned around and left the siege to Nüreddin. He wasn't about to expend money and time on a city that wasn't going to be his. Instead, Mesud marched north, and in a lightning series of strikes, captured a string of fortresses held by minor Armenian lords who were mostly in league with the Crusaders. These were Kesun, Besni, Raban, and Merzaban around Marash. This solidified Mesud's control over the crucial passes leading into the Levant from his Anatolian home. Meanwhile, the Crusaders in Tel Bashir now saw that there was no hope at all. The Second Crusade had failed, destroyed by Mesud, Manuel Komnenos, and Nüreddin. The other possessions of the erstwhile county of Edessa were now gone. The count himself, Jocelyn, had been blinded and thrown into the dungeons of Aleppo. There was simply no point in holding out any longer. But instead of handing the fortress over to Nüreddin, the Crusaders instead tried to keep it in Christian hands. And so, they turned the city over to none other than Mesud's ally, Manuel Komnenos. But this was just a pretense, I think. There was no way for Constantinople to realistically hold this city, or really even send meaningful forces there. If anything, I think it was sort of a way to make sure that the blame for the fall of the city landed on the hated emperor, and not on themselves. Soon enough, Nüreddin's troops would take the fortress and finally, permanently, end even the remnants of the county of Edessa. At the same time, as Nüreddin began the final assault to take Tel Bashir, Mesud gathered up his forces and marched on Antep. Once a critical possession of the county of Edessa, it was now likely in the hands of a local Armenian warlord. As we will discuss in more detail next time, as Crusader rule collapsed, and with the Byzantine imperial forces withdrawn after the death of Emperor John, rule of this region largely fell to the newly powerful Armenian dynasts. And it was likely one of the smaller of these Armenian rulers who was in charge of Antep as the city fell to Mesud. So by 1151, Mesud and Nüreddin had divided between themselves and then gobbled up all of the territory that had once belonged to the county of Edessa. A fitting victory feast for the victors over the Second Crusade. And I would just note that this is actually quite a departure for the sultans of Rum. If you will recall, in the past, both Mesud's father and grandfather had met their ends attempting to conquer in the east. To use their base in Anatolia to rise to the summit of power in the richer and more prestigious lands of Syria, Iraq, and Iran that constituted the center of the Muslim world. While not Mesud, he did not seek to topple Nüreddin or aspire to be the lord of the Middle East. Instead, he divided these conquests with Nüreddin, taking only the critical passes and the lands directly bordering the plateau. In other words, he contented himself with ruling Anatolia. This represents a definitive end of something in the Seljuk political world. The end of some of the grander and perhaps more delusional ambitions of the line of Kutalmış. Partly, this was the result of changed circumstances. The rise of the Zengid Emirate and the collapse of the Seljuk imperial state in what was once the western heartland of the Great Seljuk Empire. But I think it also represents the increasing Anatolianization of the Sultanate of Rum and the increasing divergence of Anatolia from the other Muslim realms. As we will discuss in a later non-narrative episode, Turkish Anatolia was now beginning to chart a new destiny. And it was becoming markedly different, not just from the lands of Byzantium, but from the other Muslim lands, something that was remarked on by contemporaries even at the time. The frontier world of Anatolia was giving birth to an entirely new society, a new culture, and a new political system. And Mesud, like the rest of the Anatolian Turkish leadership at this time, was a product of this emerging Anatolia. He was Anatolian in a way that his grandfather and even his father just weren't. And I think that this also shaped his worldview and his decision to not follow in the path of his grandfather and his father to try to take a colossal gamble to rule the Middle East. A decision that, by the way, I think speaks quite well of his wisdom and his leadership. So Syria and the lands of the Middle East were now definitively outside of the reach of the Sultanate of Rum. Anatolian Turkish rule would not reach there until the rise of the Ottomans and the conquests of Selim the Grim in about 400 years. But that did not mean that there were not other prizes that interested the resurgent and newly confident Sultan of Rum. Fortuitously, just a year after Mesud and Nüreddin finished dividing up the lands of the old county of Edessa, internal chaos came to the now tottering Danişmend Beylik. If you will recall, Mesud's old Danişmend foe, Yağ Basan, was ruling in Sivas as the Bey. Yağ Basan had been forced to bend the knee to Mesud, and according to Michael the Syrian, had even married one of Mesud's daughters. But though he was a subject of the Sultan, he was far, far from a happy vassal of Konya, and he was now using the old title that had been borne by his half-brother Muhammad, Melik, the self-styled king of the north. But it was a hollow claim. Yağ Basan now ruled only in Sivas and Amasya as a vassal of the Sultan of Rum, with his relative Ayn al-Dawla ruling in Malatya in some sort of subservient relationship to Yağ Basan. Well, in 1152, Ayn al-Dawla died in Malatya. He was succeeded by his son Dhul Qarnayn. But of course, Mesud spied his chance to seize one of the most critical cities in Anatolia. Predictably, the Sultan began assembling his armies basically the second that he heard of Ayn al-Dawlah's death. But in Sivas, Ya Abasan was of course extremely distraught at the idea of Mesud taking Malatya, and though he was wary of marching out to confront his master the Sultan alone, he urged his nephew Dhul Qarnayn to resist the Sultan. And so, Mesud marched out of Konya towards Malatya. Somewhere outside of the city, Mesud and his army crushed the Danishmand force sent to oppose them. Dhul Qarnayn now could not oppose Mesud in the field, and was forced to hunker down behind the great walls of Malatya. And so, with no forces capable of resisting him, Mesud brought his army up to Malatya and ravaged the suburbs and the farmlands around the city, areas that are today famous for their apricots. He then marched to Malatya itself and put the city to siege. I picture Mesud sitting in his tent outside the walls of the city and enjoying a wonderful Malatya apricot as he watches his men assemble the siege engines. The situation was now desperate for Dhul Qarnayn, though it was not hopeless. Even though he could not put an army in the field, Malatya's defenses were truly formidable. Mesud's father and grandfather had both struggled to take the city in the past, and the success of the Sultan was not assured. Therefore, perhaps unsurprisingly, the two sides were actually open to negotiation. Bar Hebreus relates that it was Dhul Qarnayn's mother who led the drive for a negotiated settlement. See, Dhul Qarnayn's mother was actually related to Mesud. Bar Hebreus writes, "Then the mother of the young man went forth. Now she was his brother's daughter, and she entreated him on behalf of her son. And the Sultan said, 'If he will come forth to meet me, and tender his submission, he will be received by me, and the city shall remain his.' Then the young man went forth, carrying a sword and a shroud, and the Sultan received him, and confirmed his authority, and then the young man went forth and departed." Thus, for the first time in nearly 50 years, Malatya was once again under the sovereignty of the Sultanate of Rum. Though tellingly, Mesud had not been able to sack the city or directly take it over. Instead, Dhul Qarnayn's mother, who again was related to Mesud, was given control of the city. Bar Hebreus is particularly hostile to her rule and writes that she persecuted the Christians in the city after being installed by Mesud. Yet even though his rule over Malatya was somewhat indirect, the city that had been the apple in the eye of his father Kulich Arslan was now, finally, under Mesud's sovereignty. And basically all of the great passes through the mountains connecting his Anatolian homeland to the central lands of Islam were now in his hands. The power of the Sultan of Rum had not reached this extent since the days of Kulich Arslan. And I think that we should step back and remember that a mere 10 years ago, Mesud was just one Turkish lord among many. A sultan in name, yes, but one who held just a pocket of territory around Konya, and who was vying for supremacy with King Muhammad, the Danishmand Bey, and the King of the North. In the intervening decade, Mesud had conquered his rivals in Anatolia, defeated the Crusaders, and had now consolidated control over the crucial region where Anatolia borders Syria and the heartland of the Muslim world. This was a truly shocking rise, a complete restoration of the prestige and the power of the Sultanate of Rum. Mesud, now about 55, was, I think, rightfully proud of this legacy. He had been on the throne for decades at this point, but over the past 10 or so years, he had, through painstaking work and phenomenal military victories, finally rebuilt the power of the Sultanate of Rum after the days of weakness and collapse following the death of his father. But his long reign still has one last act to play out. And so next time, we will end the story of Mesud, the longest-serving Roman Sultan, and we will also introduce his son, the next Roman Sultan, and the next Sword Lion, who, like his namesake, will preside over some of the greatest victories in Turkish history, alongside some of the most grievous defeats. Kılıç Arslan II.